In a cruel village where a frail, tiny girl was mocked as worthless, she was sold off as a joke at a local auction. The laughter stopped when a feared Mafia boss stepped forward, his voice thundering, "She'll birth my heirs." What began as mockery became deadly serious as the boss claimed her under his protection. Their union, born of ridicule, soon shook both the underworld and the village that betrayed her, proving that strength can be found in the most unexpected places. The villagers thought they were disposing of their burden, but they had no idea they were igniting a war that would consume everything they held dear. When the boss's enemies learned of his unexpected bride, they saw weakness where he saw strength. But what happens when the girl they all underestimated reveals she's far more dangerous than anyone imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lila Rosewood had learned to make herself invisible long before she understood why it was necessary. At 19, she moved through the mountain village of Ravenshollow like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cobblestones, her thin frame easily overlooked by those who preferred not to see her at all. The tarnished silver locket around her neck caught what little morning light filtered through the narrow alley where she crouched, sorting through discarded vegetables behind the baker's shop. Inside the pendant was a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and delicate features, the only proof Lila had that someone had once loved her. Her mother, Elena Rosewood, had died giving birth to her, and her father had disappeared before Lila could walk, leaving behind only whispered rumors about noble blood and shameful secrets. "There's the cursed one," old Henrik muttered as he passed, spitting into the dirt near her feet. "Sucking the life from our village, just like her mother did." Lila pressed her lips together and continued her work, her fingers expertly identifying which vegetables could still provide nourishment despite their wilted appearance. She had learned not to respond to their cruelty. It only encouraged them. Better to remain silent, invisible, forgotten. The village of Ravenshollow clung to the mountainside like a stubborn weed, its stone houses weathered by generations of harsh winters and bitter winds. The people here were as hardened as their landscape, suspicious of outsiders and cruel to those they deemed different. Lila's mother had been an outsider, arriving pregnant and alone, speaking with an educated accent that marked her as nobility fallen on hard times. She brought death with her, the village elder Matthias Blackwood often proclaimed. First the crops failed the year she arrived, then the mine collapsed, and finally she died birthing that cursed child. Every misfortune since can be traced back to her arrival. The baker's wife, Rosa, appeared at the back door with a cloth bundle. She was one of the few villagers who showed Lila any kindness, though always in secret. "Here," she whispered, pressing the bundle into Lila's hands. "Bread from yesterday and some cheese. But be quick. If Matthias sees me helping you again, he'll ban me from the market." Lila nodded gratefully, tucking the precious food into her worn cloak. Rosa's kindness came at great personal risk, and Lila never forgot that. In a village where survival depended on conformity, compassion was a luxury few could afford. "There's talk," Rosa continued, glancing nervously around the empty alley. "Matthias has been meeting with the other elders. They're saying you're old enough now to contribute to the village's well-being." A chill ran down Lila's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had heard whispers of girls from other villages being sold to traveling merchants, their families claiming it was for the greater good. At 19, she was indeed old enough to be considered a burden that could be transformed into profit. "When?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The autumn market. 3 days from now." Rosa's eyes filled with tears she couldn't shed openly. "Child, if I could do something—" "You've done more than enough," Lila assured her. "Thank you for the warning." As Rosa disappeared back into her shop, Lila made her way to the abandoned church on the village's edge, her sanctuary when the weight of their hatred became too much to bear. The building had been struck by lightning years ago, leaving it partially collapsed and deemed cursed by the superstitious villagers. For Lila, It was the one place where she could think without fear of interruption. She settled among the broken pews and pulled out her mother's locket, studying the photograph as she had countless times before. Her mother's face held secrets Lila longed to understand. Intelligence in those eyes, strength in the set of her jaw, and something else. Nobility, perhaps, or simply the confidence of someone who had once known her own worth. The autumn market would bring travelers from distant places, including those who dealt in human cargo. Lila had 3 days to prepare for whatever fate awaited her, 3 days to say goodbye to the only home she had ever known, cruel as it was. She pressed the locket to her heart and made a silent vow. Whatever happened at that market, she would face it with the dignity her mother's photograph suggested she deserved. The villagers might sell her like livestock, but they could not touch the core of who she was, the part of her that remembered she was Elena Rosewood's daughter, noble blood flowing in her veins despite the circumstances of her birth. The wind whistled through the broken church windows, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the promise of change. Lila pulled her cloak tighter and prepared herself for whatever destiny awaited her at the autumn market. The autumn market arrived with the crisp bite of mountain air and the raucous laughter of villagers treating the day like a festival. Wooden stalls lined the village square, displaying everything from livestock to handcrafted goods, while the scent of roasted meat and mulled wine filled the air. For most, it was a celebration of the harvest season. For Lila, it was the day her life would be auctioned away. She stood beside the weathered stone platform that served as the village's auction block, her hands bound with rough rope that chafed against her wrists. The villagers had dressed her in a simple white dress, supposedly to make her appear more valuable, though the thin fabric did little to ward off the mountain chill or preserve her dignity. "Look at her," cackled old Meredith, pointing a gnarled finger in Lila's direction. "Skin and bones. What man would want such a pitiful thing?" "That's the beauty of it," Matthias Blackwood replied, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man who believed himself clever. "We'll start the bidding low. Someone will take her just for the novelty, and we'll be rid of our burden." The crowd gathered around the auction block like vultures circling carrion. Lila recognized every face. These were the people who had watched her grow up hungry and alone, who had denied her work, who had treated her like a curse upon their community. Now they laughed and pointed, as if her suffering was entertainment designed for their amusement. Then the laughter stopped. A black carriage had appeared at the edge of the square, its approach so silent that it seemed to materialize from shadow itself. The horses were magnificent beasts with coats like polished obsidian, and they moved with the controlled power of predators. But it was the man who emerged, from the carriage that transformed the festive atmosphere into something approaching terror. Marco Santangelo stood 6 feet, tall with broad shoulders that filled his expensive black coat. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the mountain wind, and his face bore the kind of sharp, aristocratic features that spoke of generations of breeding for both beauty and strength. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark as midnight and holding depths that suggested he had seen things that would break lesser men. More striking than his appearance was the obsidian ring on his right hand, carved with an intricate family crest that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Those who knew anything about the criminal underworld would recognize the Santangelo mark, a symbol that commanded respect and fear across 3 countries. The villagers pressed back instinctively as Marco approached the auction block. His expensive leather boots clicked against the cobblestones with the rhythm of a funeral march, and the crowd parted before him like sheep before a wolf. Even Matthias Blackwood, for all his bluster and self-importance, seemed to shrink in the presence of this unexpected visitor. "Continue," Marco said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. His accent held traces of Italian sophistication layered over something harder, more dangerous. "I came to observe your commerce." Matthias cleared his throat nervously, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of his plan. "Of course, sir. We were just, that is to say, we have a young woman here who—" He gestured weakly toward Lila, as if embarrassed by his own words. Marco's gaze fell upon Lila, and she felt something shift in the air between them. Where others saw a worthless waif, his eyes seemed to catalogue details, the proud set of her shoulders despite her circumstances, the intelligence that sparked in her green eyes, the way she held her chin high, even while bound and humiliated. "She'll birth my heirs," Marco declared, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. The words struck the crowd like a physical blow. Nervous laughter died in throats suddenly gone dry. Hands that had been pointing and gesturing fell to sides in shocked silence. The very idea that this powerful, dangerous man saw value where they saw only burden was enough to shatter their comfortable assumptions about Lila's worthlessness. "Sir, that is—" Matthias stammered, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, fear, and dawning realization. "Are you making an offer?" Marco reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. He tossed it at Matthias's feet, where it landed with a heavy thud that echoed in the sudden silence. "That should be sufficient," Marco said. "Have her belongings gathered. We leave within the hour." The amount of gold spilling from the pouch was more than the entire village would see in a year of good harvests. But the villagers who had moments before been laughing at Lila's expense now looked terrified, as if they suddenly understood they had been playing with forces beyond their comprehension. Marco stepped onto the auction platform and cut Lila's bonds with a knife that appeared and disappeared so quickly she barely saw the blade. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he helped her down from the block, and when he spoke to her, his voice held none of the menace that had silenced the crowd. "You belong to me now," he said simply. "No one will harm you again." The carriage ride through the mountain passes felt like traveling between worlds. Lila sat across from Marco in silence, her hands folded in her lap as she tried to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The luxurious interior of the carriage, velvet seats, polished wood panels, and brass fittings that gleamed like gold, was more opulent than anything she had ever imagined, let alone experienced. Marco remained equally silent, his dark eyes occasionally studying her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. When their gazes met, Lila saw something unexpected in his expression, not the predatory hunger she might have expected from a man who had just purchased a bride, but a thoughtful assessment tinged with what might have been concern. "Are you hungry?" he asked finally, producing a small basket from beneath his seat. Inside were delicate pastries, fresh fruit, and cheese that smelled of herbs and cream. "The journey to my estate will take several hours." Lila's stomach clenched at the sight of such abundance, but years of surviving on scraps had taught her caution. "Why did you choose me?" she asked instead of reaching for the food. Marco's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "You stood straight despite being bound. You looked at me directly when others would have cowered. Strength comes in many forms, Miss Rosewood." The fact that he knew her surname caught her off guard. She had never told him her name, and the villagers had likely referred to her only as the Cursed One or the Girl. How did this dangerous stranger know details about her that even she barely understood? As they descended from the mountain village, the landscape transformed dramatically. Rolling hills gave way to cultivated valleys, and well-maintained roads replaced the rough mountain tracks. Prosperous farms dotted the countryside, their fields heavy with autumn harvest, and their buildings speaking of wealth and careful management. The Sant'Angelo estate appeared in the distance like something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales included imposing iron gates that seemed designed more for keeping enemies out than guests in. The gates themselves were works of art, elaborate scrollwork depicting roses entwined with thorns, their black metal gleaming with fresh oil and careful maintenance. "Home," Marco said simply, as the carriage approached the entrance. Two men emerged from a guardhouse built into the stone pillars that flanked the gate. They were clearly soldiers rather than servants, their bearing military and their eyes constantly scanning for threats. When they recognized the carriage, they snapped to attention with the precision of well-trained troops. "Vincent," Marco called to the taller of the two men, a lean figure with graying temples and intelligent eyes. "Prepare the east wing. Miss Rosewood will require appropriate accommodations." Vincent's gaze flicked to Lila with professional assessment before nodding. "Of course, Don Marco. Shall I inform the household staff of any special requirements?" "Discretion," Marco replied, "and patience. This transition will require adjustment." As the carriage rolled through the gates, Lila caught her first glimpse of the mansion that would become her new prison or sanctuary. She wasn't yet sure which. The building was massive, built of honey-colored stone that glowed in the afternoon sunlight. Multiple wings extended from a central structure that rose 3 stories into the sky, while manicured gardens created geometric patterns of color and texture across the grounds. Servants appeared as if summoned by invisible signals, their movements coordinated with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed dance. Lila noticed that while they bowed respectfully to Marco, their eyes held genuine affection rather than mere fear. Whatever kind of master he was, he inspired loyalty, along with obedience. The carriage stopped before a grand entrance, where marble steps led to doors that could have accommodated giants. Vincent opened the carriage door and offered his hand to help Lila down, his manner respectful but not overly familiar. "Welcome to the Sant'Angelo estate, miss," he said formally. "If you require anything during your stay, please don't hesitate to ask." Stay. The word suggested temporary residence rather than permanent captivity, though Lila wasn't naive enough to believe she would be free to leave whenever she chose. Still, the courtesy in Vincent's manner and the obvious respect shown by the household staff suggested her situation might be more complex than simple ownership. Marco appeared beside them, his presence immediately commanding attention from every servant within sight. "Vincent will show you to your rooms," he told Lila. "Dinner is at 7. I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction." He paused, studying her face once more with those penetrating dark eyes. "This is not a prison, Miss Rosewood, but neither is it the world you knew. Take time to understand the difference." As Vincent led her up the marble steps and through doors that opened onto a foyer more magnificent than any church she had ever seen, Lila felt the final threads connecting her to her old life stretch and snap. Whatever lay ahead, there would be no returning. To the girl who had scrounged for vegetables behind the baker's shop, the threshold of the Sant'Angelo mansion was more than an entrance. It was a gateway between who she had been and who she was destined to become. The east wing of the Sant'Angelo mansion felt like a palace within a palace. And Lila's assigned rooms, plural, she realized with amazement, consisted of a bedroom, larger than most village houses, a private sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a bathroom that featured a marble tub deep enough to swim in. But it was while exploring her new domain that she discovered the gallery that would teach her the true weight of what she had inherited. The portrait gallery stretched the length of the wing's main corridor, its walls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men in expensive clothing, spanning what appeared to be several centuries. Each portrait bore a small brass nameplate, Alessandro Sant'Angelo, 1642-1691, Giovanni Sant'Angelo, 1673-1734, Roberto Sant'Angelo, 1701-1769. The dates told a story of unbroken lineage, of power passed from father to son through generations of careful planning and ruthless determination. Impressive, isn't it? Marco's voice came from behind her, causing Lila to turn with a start. She hadn't heard him approach, which spoke to either his natural stealth or her complete absorption in the portraits. "Your family?" she asked, though the resemblance was unmistakable. Each man in the gallery shared variations of Marco's sharp features, the same intelligent dark eyes, the same bearing that suggested absolute confidence in their right to command. 5 centuries of Sant'Angelo patriarchs, Marco confirmed, joining her before a particularly imposing portrait of a man in 18th century dress. Each one left his mark on the family legacy. Each one faced the same burden, ensuring the continuation of our bloodline and the preservation of our power. The weight in his voice suggested this burden was more complex than simple family pride. Lila studied the painted faces surrounding them, noting how many bore expressions of weariness alongside their authority. Power, it seemed, came with prices that accumulated over generations. "My father is dying," Marco said without preamble, his words falling into the gallery's silence like stones into still water. "He has perhaps 6 months, according to his physicians. For the past year, he has reminded me daily that I am 34 years old and have failed in my primary duty, providing an heir to carry on the Sant'Angelo name." Lila felt a chill of understanding. This wasn't about attraction or even companionship. This was about dynastic necessity, about ensuring that the gallery wouldn't end with Marco's portrait. "The other families sense weakness," Marco continued, his gaze moving along the row of ancestors. "The Morettis, the DeMarcos, the Castellanos, they circle like wolves waiting for any sign that the Sant'Angelo power is failing. A man without sons is a man without future, and in our world, that makes him vulnerable to challenges he might otherwise never face." "So you need me to produce an heir," Lila said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. The bluntness of the situation might have horrified another woman, but years of hardship had taught her to face reality without flinching. Marco turned to study her face, his expression unreadable. "I need you to understand what you've entered. This isn't a conventional marriage, Miss Rosewood. This is a political alliance disguised as domestic arrangement. Your children, our children, will inherit not just wealth and property, but also enemies, obligations, and dangers you cannot yet imagine." They paused before the most recent portrait, a man who shared Marco's features but whose face bore the unmistakable marks of long illness. Don Salvatore Sant'Angelo, the nameplate read, though no death date had yet been added. "He was a good father," Marco said quietly. "Demanding, sometimes ruthless, but fair in his own way. He taught me that power without purpose is merely cruelty, and purpose without power is merely wishful thinking. The balance between them, that's what has kept our family strong for 5 centuries. What happens if I fail to give you sons?" Lila asked, voicing the question that hung between them like a sword. Marco's smile was surprisingly gentle. "You won't fail, Miss Rosewood. You have strength in you. I saw it the moment you looked at me directly despite being bound and humiliated. That strength will serve you well in the years ahead." He gestured toward the empty space at the gallery's end, where future portraits would eventually hang. "Someday, your son's portrait will join this collection. Perhaps your grandson's as well. You're not just becoming my wife. You're becoming part of a legacy that will outlive us both." As they walked back toward her rooms, Lila found herself thinking not of the burden she was accepting, but of the possibility it represented. For the first time in her life, someone saw her not as a burden or a mistake, but as essential to a future larger than herself. The portrait gallery had shown her the weight of Sant'Angelo history, but it had also shown her something else, that she would not merely be added to their story. She would help write its next chapter. That evening, alone in her opulent rooms, Lila discovered a small leather-bound journal among the supplies Vincent had thoughtfully provided. The book was simple but well made, its pages blank and waiting, its leather cover soft with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of quality without ostentation. As she held it in her hands, she realized it might be the first thing in her life that was truly hers, not discarded by others, not grudgingly given, but placed there specifically for her use. She settled at the writing desk by the window, where the last light of evening painted the gardens in shades of gold and amber. With a pen that wrote more smoothly than anything she had ever touched, she began to record her thoughts. needing to process the whirlwind of change that had transformed her life in a single day. I am no longer Lila the cursed one, the village burden, the girl who scrounged for scraps behind the baker's shop. Today, I became something else entirely, though I'm not yet sure what. Marco Sant'Angelo, Don Marco as his people call him, purchased me at auction like livestock, yet treats me like a guest. He speaks of heirs and legacy, of duty and danger, but his eyes hold neither cruelty nor hunger, only assessment, as if he sees something in me that I haven't yet discovered in myself. As she wrote, Lila found her thoughts clarifying. The act of putting her experiences into words forced her to examine them more carefully, to look beyond her immediate fears and confusion toward the larger patterns emerging around her. The household staff treats me with respect, bordering on deference. The maid who helped me bathe spoke of the new Donna, as if my role here was already established and accepted. Vincent, who is clearly more than just a servant, addressed me as Miss Rosewood, with the same formality he uses for Marco. Either they are all excellent actors, or my position here is more significant than mere purchased bride. Through her window, Lila could see lights beginning to appear in the mansion's other wings. The Sant'Angelo estate was large enough to house dozens of people, and she was beginning to understand that it functioned less like a private home and more like the headquarters of a complex organization. Marco wasn't just a wealthy man, he was the center of a web of relationships, obligations, and enterprises that extended far beyond these walls. The portrait gallery showed me the weight of 5 centuries of Sant'Angelo power. Each face in those paintings represented a man who shaped history, who made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Marco speaks of continuing that legacy as if it were a sacred trust rather than mere family pride. If I am to bear his heirs, I am not just providing children. I am ensuring the continuation of something larger than myself. A soft knock at her door interrupted her writing. "Come in," she called, expecting to see the maid returning with evening refreshments. Instead, Marco himself entered, carrying a tray that held 2 cups of tea and a selection of small cakes. The sight of the powerful Don Sant'Angelo serving tea struck Lila as so incongruous that she almost smiled. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on a small table near her chair. "Dinner will be formal tomorrow, but tonight I thought we might speak privately." "About what?" Lila asked, closing her journal and turning to face him. "About you," Marco replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I know a great deal about your circumstances, Miss Rosewood, but very little about you as a person. If we are to build a life together, however unconventional, we should at least attempt to understand each other." Lila accepted the offered tea, noting that it was perfectly prepared, neither too strong nor too weak, sweetened exactly to her taste, though she had never told him her preferences. Someone had been paying attention to details about her that she hadn't even realized were observable. "What would you like to know?" she asked. "Everything," Marco said simply. "Your thoughts, your dreams, your fears. Your mother, Elena Rosewood, was clearly more than the villagers understood. You carry yourself with a dignity that speaks of noble blood. Despite the circumstances of your upbringing," the mention of her mother's name in his voice sent a shiver through Lila. "How do you know about my mother?" Marco's expression grew thoughtful. "Elena Rosewood was a woman of some significance before she arrived in Ravenshollow. Her disappearance nearly 20 years ago caused quite a stir in certain circles. When I learned of your existence, I made inquiries." "What kind of inquiries?" Lila's voice was barely above a whisper, the kind that revealed that you, Miss Rosewood, are far more valuable than even I initially realized. 3 days into her new life at the Sant'Angelo estate, Lila was beginning to understand the rhythms of a household that operated like a small city when Vincent burst into the breakfast room with an expression that transformed Marco from relaxed companion to dangerous predator in an instant. "Don Marco," Vincent said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "We have a problem." On the table between them, nestled among the morning's correspondence, lay a single red rose, At first glance, it appeared to be a romantic gesture, the kind of flower a suitor might send to express admiration. But Lila noticed immediately that something was wrong with it. The petals, while perfectly formed and vibrantly colored, had an unnatural sheen that caught the light strangely. Marco's reaction was immediate and violent. He swept Lila away from the table with one arm while drawing a pistol with the other. His movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. "Don't touch it," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Don't even breathe near it. What is it?" Lila asked, though the chill running down her spine suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "A message," Marco replied grimly, studying the rose from a safe distance. "The Moretti family's signature calling card. The rose has been treated with a contact poison, beautiful to look at, deadly to handle." Vincent had already begun issuing orders to guards who appeared as if summoned by telepathy. "Seal the breakfast room. No one enters without protective gear. Send word to Dr. Castellano. We'll need the antidote prepared as a precaution." Lila found herself marveling at the efficiency with which the household responded to this crisis. Within minutes, the room was evacuated and secured. Protective protocols were in place, and Marco was receiving reports from security teams positioned throughout the estate. This wasn't their first encounter with such threats. "Why a rose?" Lila asked as they moved to Marco's private study, where armed guards took positions at every entrance. "Antonio Moretti considers himself a poet," Marco explained, his tone carrying contempt. "He believes his murders should be artistic statements rather than mere eliminations. The poisoned rose is his way of saying that beauty and death are intertwined, and that he can reach into my home whenever he chooses." The implications struck Lila like physical blows. This wasn't just a threat against Marco, it was a message about her as well. By choosing her as his future wife, Marco had made her a target for enemies who saw any happiness or stability in his life as something to be destroyed. "How many enemies do you have?" Unshi asked, settling into a chair that Vincent positioned to give her clear sightlines to all exits. "In our world, enemies are currency," Marco replied. "The more powerful you become, the more people want to tear you down. The Morettis have been rivals for 3 generations. The DiMarcos control territory we need for expansion. The Castellanos believe they have a better claim to leadership in this region." He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a leather folder filled with photographs and documents. "These are the people who would kill you simply because you matter to me. Not out of personal hatred, they don't even know you, but because eliminating you would cause me pain, and my pain serves their interests." Lila studied the photographs he spread before her, faces that looked ordinary, even pleasant until she noticed their eyes. Each one carried the flat, emotionless gaze of someone who had learned to see other people as obstacles rather than fellow human beings. "The poison rose tells us several things," Marco continued, his voice taking on the analytical tone of someone breaking down a tactical situation. "First, they have people inside our security perimeter. Someone placed that rose on our breakfast table without triggering any alarms. Second, they're escalating their campaign against us rather than waiting for a better opportunity. Third, they're confident enough to issue direct threats rather than working from shadows." "What does that mean for me?" Lila asked, though she suspected she wasn't going to like the answer. Marco's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "It means your education begins immediately. You need to learn to recognize threats, to defend yourself, to think like someone whose life is constantly in danger. The woman who was sold at auction 3 days ago was a victim. The woman who will bear my children must be a survivor." As if summoned by his words, Vincent returned with a collection of items that looked like props from a deadly theatrical production. Knives, small firearms, and devices whose purposes Lila couldn't immediately identify. "Your first lesson," Marco said gently but firmly, "is learning that in our world, beauty and danger are always intertwined. That rose could have killed you with a single touch. Tomorrow, I'll teach you to recognize similar threats and how to eliminate them before they eliminate you." 2 weeks after the poison rose incident, Leela found herself standing before a massive table in Marco's war room, a chamber she hadn't known existed until Vincent led her through a hidden door behind the library's bookshelf. The table dominated the room, its polished surface covered with an intricate map that looked like a general's battle plan rather than anything she had expected to see in a private home. The map showed the entire region in meticulous detail, marked with colored pins, string connections, and handwritten notes that transformed the familiar geography into something resembling a chessboard. Red pins marked Moretti territory. Blue indicated Sant'Angelo holdings, green showed neutral zones, and yellow highlighted areas of active dispute. Lines of string connected various locations, creating a web of relationships and dependencies that spoke to the complex nature of criminal enterprise. "This is how we see the world," Marco explained, joining her at the table's edge. "Not as cities and counties, but as territories and influence zones. Every business, every official, every significant family falls somewhere on this map, according to their allegiances and usefulness." Lila studied the intricate network with growing fascination. She had lived her entire life in ignorance of the larger forces that shaped the world around her. But this map revealed structures of power that extended far beyond what she had imagined possible. "The casino in Millbrook," Marco continued, pointing to a blue pin connected by string to several other locations, "provides income and serves as a meeting place for neutral negotiations. The shipping company in Riverside allows us to move goods without government interference. The construction firm in Westford builds our properties and occasionally disposes of problems that require discretion." "What kind of problems?" Leela asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that disappear into building foundations," Marco replied matter-of-factly. "Our world operates by different rules than the one you knew, Lila. Justice comes from strength, not courts. Debts are paid in full, or they compound with interest that few can afford." Over the past 2 weeks, Leila had been receiving what Marco called her education, self-defense lessons with Vincent, who possessed the patience of a saint and the reflexes of a cat. Weapons training with Maria, a deadly woman who served as the estate's head of security and who could kill a man with her bare hands while discussing the weather. Strategy sessions, where she learned to think several moves ahead, to anticipate consequences before taking action. But it was during these map sessions that Lila began to understand the true scope of what she had entered. The Sant'Angelo organization wasn't simply a criminal gang. It was a shadow government that influenced everything from local elections to international shipping routes. "Your insights have been unexpected," Marco said, studying her face as she absorbed the information. "Yesterday, when you suggested that the Morettis might be using the flower shop in Eastbridge as a communications hub, you identified a connection that had escaped our notice for months." Lila felt a flush of pride at his words. She had always been observant. Survival in Ravenshollow had required careful attention to human behavior and hidden motivations. But here, those same skills were not just useful but valued. "You think differently than we do," Marco continued. "We see territories and assets. You see people and patterns. When you pointed out that Mrs. Patterson, the florist, had been making unusual purchases of specific flower varieties, you weren't thinking about criminal enterprise. You were thinking about a woman whose behavior had changed in ways that suggested outside pressure." The investigation that followed had indeed revealed that Mrs. Patterson was being forced to pass messages between Moretti operatives, her flower arrangements serving as coded communications that appeared innocent to casual observers. The discovery had allowed the Sant'Angelos to intercept crucial intelligence about planned moves against their operations. "I've been watching you," Marco said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Not just learning about you, but watching how your mind works. You have a gift for seeing what others miss, for understanding motivations that drive people toward choices that seem illogical on the surface. He moved several pins on the map, adjusting the web of connections to reflect recent developments. The other families are beginning to take notice of changes in our operations. Our intelligence gathering has improved dramatically. Our anticipation of their moves has become uncannily accurate. They don't yet know why, but they're starting to suspect that we have some new advantage. They think you have a new spy, Lila realized. Exactly. And in a way we do, though not the kind they imagine. You see patterns in human behavior that our trained operatives miss because they're looking for criminal motivations rather than human ones. Marco paused at a section of the map marked with several yellow pins, disputed territories where multiple families vied for control. There's going to be a war, Lila, not immediately, but soon. The other families are forming alliances against us, and when they move, it will be with overwhelming force designed to crush us completely. The weight of his words settled over the room like a shroud. Lila studied the map with new eyes, seeing not just territories and influence zones, but the gathering storm that would soon engulf everyone she was coming to care about. The evening Marco presented her with the ring, Lila understood that everything between them had fundamentally changed. They were in the mansion's private garden, where late-blooming roses climbed trellises that David Santangelo, Marco's grandfather, had designed decades earlier. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and crimson, creating the kind of romantic atmosphere that belonged in fairy tales rather than the dangerous reality of their lives. The ring itself was breathtaking, a massive emerald surrounded by diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. But more significant than its beauty was what it represented. This wasn't the simple gold band that might seal a business arrangement. This was a statement piece, the kind of jewelry that announced to the world that its wearer was claimed, protected, and valued beyond mere utility. It belonged to my great-grandmother, Marco explained as he slipped it onto her finger. Isabella Santangelo wore it through 3 assassination attempts, 2 family wars, and 47 years of marriage to a man who loved her more than his own life. The weight of the ring on her hand felt like accepting a crown. Beautiful, powerful, and heavy with responsibilities she was still learning to understand. Over the past month, Lila had begun to think of their arrangement as a partnership of necessity rather than a true marriage. But the care with which Marco had chosen this particular ring, the significance he placed on its history, suggested something deeper was developing between them. The emerald comes from mines in Colombia that have been in Santangelo hands for over a century, Marco continued, his fingers intertwining with hers as he spoke. The diamonds were selected personally by Isabella herself, each one representing a different aspect of the strength she believed necessary for survival in our world. Lila studied the ring in the fading light, noting how the emerald seemed to glow with inner fire, while the diamonds created a constellation around it. "What aspects?" she asked, clarity to see through deception. "Hardness, to withstand pressure that would crush others. Brilliance, to outshine those who would diminish you. And permanence, because diamonds, like true strength, last forever." As he spoke, Lila realized they were no longer discussing jewelry, but something far more profound. The past weeks had shown her sides of Marco that contradicted his fearsome reputation. Yes, he was capable of devastating violence when threatened. Yes, he commanded an organization that operated outside conventional law. But he was also capable of surprising gentleness, unexpected humor, and a kind of protective tenderness that made her feel valued in ways she had never experienced. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said, voicing the question that hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "I'm asking you to be my partner in everything," Marco replied. "Not just in producing heirs, but in building something that will outlast us both. The woman who wore this ring before you helped transform the Santangelo family from common criminals into an organization with honor, purpose, and lasting power." He gestured toward the mansion's glowing windows. where she could see members of the household staff moving about their evening duties. Everyone here depends on us for their security, their livelihood, their future. The decisions we make affect hundreds of people directly and thousands more indirectly. I need someone beside me who understands that responsibility and embraces it rather than simply enduring it. Lila looked down at the ring again, watching how the emerald seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. And if I say yes, what changes? Everything, Marco said simply. You stop being my protected guest and become my equal partner. You take on the full weight of what it means to be a Sant'Angelo. You accept that our enemies will target you not just to hurt me, but because you'll represent a threat to them in your own right. And if I say no, Marco's expression grew serious, then you remain under my protection, but nothing more. You'll be safe, comfortable, provided for, but you'll never be truly part of what we're building here. Lila considered the choice he was offering. A month ago, she had been a powerless outcast, scrounging for survival. Now she was being asked to help lead an organization that wielded more real power than most governments. The transformation was so dramatic it felt surreal, but as she looked at Marco's face in the gathering twilight, she saw something that decided her. Genuine hope, mixed with vulnerability that he rarely allowed others to see. This powerful, dangerous man was asking her to choose him not just as protector, but as true partner. Yes, she said, surprising herself with how certain she sounded. I'll marry you, Marco Sant'Angelo, and I'll help you build something worthy of this. Ring! The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest. Night Vincent found the documents hidden in a wall safe, behind a portrait of Marco's great-uncle, a man who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1953. The safe had been opened with the correct combination, but appeared to have been searched by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. What they had left behind changed everything Lila thought she knew about her own identity. Don Marco, Vincent said, his voice carrying the weight of earth-shaking revelation as he entered the study where Marco and Lila were reviewing security protocols. You need to see these immediately. The bloodline documents were old, some dating back over 2 centuries, written in formal script on parchment that had yellowed with age. Official seals, family crests, and genealogical records created a paper trail that told a story both magnificent and terrible. As Marco spread the documents across his desk, Lila felt her world shifting on its axis once again. Elena Rosewood, Marco read from the top document, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Born Elena Castellano, eldest daughter of Don Alessandro Castellano, rightful heir to the Castellano territories and fortune. Lila's hands trembled as she reached for the documents. The name Castellano was familiar. Marco had mentioned them as one of the rival families, but these papers painted a different picture entirely. According to the genealogical records, the Castellanos weren't just another criminal organization. They were descendants of Italian nobility, their bloodline traceable to merchant princes who had wielded power in Renaissance city-states. Your mother didn't flee to Ravenshollow as a pregnant refugee, Marco continued, his tone gentle but relentless. She was hiding there, protecting you from people who would have killed you to prevent any challenge to the Castellano succession. The documents told the story in meticulous detail. Elena Castellano had been engaged to marry the heir of another powerful family when she fell in love with a minor noble, Lila's father. Their secret marriage had been discovered just as Elena learned she was pregnant, triggering a family crisis that threatened to tear apart carefully arranged alliances. Alessandro Castellano was forced to choose between his daughter and his empire, Marco explained, pointing to a letter written in Elena's own hand. He chose his empire. Elena was declared dead, her marriage annulled, and orders were given to eliminate both her and her unborn child. Vincent added more documents to the growing pile: birth certificates, marriage records, and most damning of all, a will that left the entirety of the Castellano holdings to Elena Rosewood and her heirs. Your grandfather never changed his will, Vincent said quietly. Despite disowning your mother publicly, he never removed her as his heir. Lila stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what they revealed. Are you saying I'm the rightful heir to the Castellano Empire? I'm saying you're the only legitimate heir, Marco replied. The men who currently control Castellano territory are distant cousins who assumed power after your grandfather's death 10 years ago. They've been ruling an empire they have no legal right to possess. The implications struck her like physical blows. Her entire life, the poverty, the cruelty, the sense of being unwanted and worthless, had been built on a lie. She wasn't a village outcast born of shameful circumstances. She was the missing heir to one of the most powerful criminal dynasties in the region. Why are you showing me this now? Lila asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Marco's expression grew serious. Because I didn't choose you randomly at that auction, Lila. I knew exactly who you were before I ever set foot in Raven's Hollow. Everything, our marriage, your education, your integration into our operations, has been preparation for this moment. The betrayal hit her like a slap. You've been lying to me from the beginning. I've been protecting you, Marco corrected firmly. The current Castellano leadership has spent 20 years believing you were dead. If they had learned of your survival before you were ready to claim your inheritance, you would have been eliminated within hours. Vincent spread out a final set of documents, more recent papers, that showed the scope of the Castellano holdings. Businesses, properties, investments, and criminal enterprises worth hundreds of millions of dollars, all legally belonging to Elena Rosewood's daughter. The other family's recent alliance against us makes sense now, Marco continued. They're not just trying to eliminate Sant'Angelo power. They're trying to prevent you from reclaiming what's rightfully yours. If you assert your claim to the Castellano Empire, you become the most powerful crime family leader in the region overnight. Lila looked at the engagement ring on her finger, Isabella Sant'Angelo's emerald, and realized it had been more than a symbol of love. It had been preparation for a crown she never knew she was destined to wear. What happens now? She asked. Marco's smile was sharp as a blade. Now, my love, we go to war. The family war council table had witnessed 5 centuries of Sant'Angelo decision-making, but never a meeting quite like this one. Carved from a single massive oak that had fallen during a storm in 1847, the table bore the scars of countless discussions that had shaped the criminal underworld. Knife marks from moments of heated disagreement, wine stains from toasts celebrating victories, and burn marks from cigars smoked during long nights of strategic planning. Now, for the first time in its history, a woman sat at its head. Lila had insisted on claiming the position that was rightfully hers as the Castellano heir, and Marco had supported her decision despite the shocked expressions of some of the older family members. Vincent sat to her right, his loyalty unwavering despite the dramatic revelation of her true identity. Marco took the seat to her left, but it was clear to everyone present that this meeting belonged to her. "Gentlemen," Lila began, her voice carrying the authority she was still learning to wield, "we are here to discuss the reclamation of stolen property, specifically an empire that has been illegally occupied for the past decade." The men gathered around the table represented the core of Sant'Angelo power. Captains who controlled different aspects of their operations, advisors who had served the family for decades, and allies whose support would be crucial in the coming conflict. Most of them had initially seen Lila as an ornamental addition to Marco's household. Now they were being asked to follow her into a war that would determine the balance of power throughout the region. The current Castellano leadership consists of 3 cousins, Vincent reported, consulting files that detailed their enemies' strengths and weaknesses. Roberto Castellano controls the legitimate businesses, restaurants, construction companies, import operations. Giuseppe manages the illegal enterprises, gambling, protection, smuggling. Angelo handles enforcement and maintains their private army. Lila studied the photographs and dossiers spread before her, memorizing faces and details with the intensity of someone whose life depended on such knowledge. These weren't abstract enemies, but specific individuals who had built their power on the foundation of her family's murder. Their greatest strength is also their greatest weakness, she observed, pointing to the organizational charts that showed how the three cousins had divided their inherited empire. They've split authority instead of centralizing it. That creates opportunities for us to exploit the divisions between them. Marco nodded approvingly. What kind of opportunities? Giuseppe has been skimming profits from the gambling operations, Lila replied, having spent hours studying financial records that Vincent's intelligence network had obtained. Roberto suspects but can't prove it without Angelo's support for an investigation. Angelo knows about the skimming, but benefits from it through side deals with Giuseppe. She moved photographs around the table like chess pieces, illustrating the web of mistrust and competing interests that weaken their enemy's position. If we can provide Roberto with proof of Giuseppe's theft at the right moment, we can trigger a civil war within their organization. And while they're fighting each other, Vincent added, understanding her strategy immediately, we move to reclaim key assets and territories. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Rather than launching a direct assault against a unified enemy, they would turn the Castellano cousins against each other and pick up the pieces when the dust settled. It required patience, precision, and perfect timing, qualities that Lila was discovering she possessed in abundance. There's another factor we need to consider, Marco said, his expression growing serious. Your grandfather's will doesn't just make you heir to the Castellano Empire, it makes you a target for every family that has business relationships with the current leadership. The Morettis, the DeMarcos, even smaller organizations that depend on Castellano protection will see your claim as a threat to their own stability. Then we give them a choice, Lila replied with cold certainty. Submit to the rightful authority, or be destroyed along with the usurpers. The words sounded strange, coming from her own mouth. 6 weeks ago, she couldn't have imagined speaking with such casual violence. But the documents proving her heritage had awakened something in her blood, a ruthless clarity that felt both foreign and familiar. The wedding will provide perfect cover for our preparations, Marco continued. Everyone expects us to be focused on celebration rather than war. They'll interpret our increased security as normal precautions for a high-profile event rather than preparation for assault. Lila looked around the table at the faces of men who had initially seen her as Marco's pretty acquisition and now recognized her as their future leader. The transformation felt surreal, but also inevitable, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life without knowing it. How long do we have? She asked. The current Castellano leadership is planning their own move against us, Vincent replied. Our intelligence suggests they'll strike during your wedding, believing they can eliminate both you and Marco in a single coordinated attack. Perfect, Lila said, her smile as sharp as her ancestors had been. Let them come. The wedding dress hung in Lila's dressing room like a declaration of war disguised as bridal attire, crafted from silk that had been woven in Italy and embroidered with threads of real gold. It was designed to transform her from Marco's bride into the reigning matriarch of the most powerful criminal dynasty in the region. But it was the hidden modifications that made it truly remarkable. Maria, the estate's head of security, had personally overseen the dress's construction. Beneath the flowing silk were reinforced panels that could stop a knife blade. The bodice contained hidden pockets for weapons so small they were virtually undetectable. The full skirt concealed holsters for backup firearms, while the train could be released with a single hidden clasp, allowing for unrestricted movement if violence erupted. You look like an angel preparing for battle, Marco said from the doorway, his own formal attire equally deceptive in its elegance. Like her dress, his tuxedo had been modified to accommodate the weapons he would carry to their own wedding. That's exactly what I am, Lila replied, checking the small blade concealed in her bouquet's handle. Over the past weeks, her transformation had accelerated beyond anything she had thought possible. The frightened girl sold at auction had become someone capable of planning war while discussing flower arrangements. Vincent appeared with final intelligence reports. Roberto Castellano received the evidence about Giuseppe skimming an hour ago. Phone intercepts confirm they're already arguing. Angelo is trying to mediate, but both sides are demanding his support. Perfect timing, Lila said, adjusting the emerald engagement ring that would soon be joined by a wedding band that contained a hidden tracking device. By the time they realize we orchestrated their conflict, it will be too late. The guests were already arriving, a carefully curated mixture of allies, neutral parties, and enemies who believed they were attending a celebration rather than walking into a trap. Every invitation had been planned, every seating arrangement designed to maximize the intelligence they could gather from overheard conversations. The Moretti family sent their regrets, Marco reported. They claim illness, but our sources confirm they're positioning their forces for what they believe will be an easy victory while we're distracted by festivities. Let them come, Lila said, her voice carrying the cold certainty that had become her trademark. Today, I stop being the girl they sold as a joke and become the woman who will destroy them all. She looked at herself in the mirror one final time, beautiful, deadly, and ready to claim her birthright. The wedding dress that had been designed to celebrate new beginnings would instead mark the end of everyone who had underestimated her worth. The Sant'Angelo family sword had not been drawn in anger for 37 years, not since Marco's grandfather had used it to end a blood feud that threatened to destroy their empire. Now, as chaos erupted around the wedding ceremony, Marco pulled the ancient blade from its ceremonial sheath and felt the weight of 5 centuries of family honor in his hands. The attack began precisely as Lila was speaking her vows, the timing calculated to catch them at their most vulnerable moment. Armed men in servers' uniforms emerged from behind the catering stations, while snipers positioned on surrounding rooftops opened fire on the gathered guests. The beautiful garden ceremony transformed into a battlefield in the space of heartbeats. But the attackers had made a crucial miscalculation. They expected to find a wedding party, not a military operation disguised as celebration. Lila moved with lethal grace, her modified wedding dress allowing her to fight as effectively as any soldier. The blade concealed in her bouquet found its target in the throat of the first assassin who reached the altar, while her other hand drew the pistol hidden beneath her flowing train. She was no longer the frightened girl from Raven's Hollow, but a warrior who had discovered her true nature in the crucible of violence. Behind the rose trellis, Vincent shouted, coordinating the defense with the precision of someone who had anticipated this exact scenario. The estate's security team had been positioned throughout the garden, disguised as photographers, musicians, and additional catering staff. When the attack began, they revealed themselves as the elite soldiers they truly were. Marco fought his way toward the main group of attackers, the ancestral sword singing through the air as it cut down enemies who had underestimated both his skill and his rage. This wasn't just an assault on his wedding. It was an attempt to murder the woman he had come to love with an intensity that surprised him. The Castellano pretenders are making their move. Maria reported through their concealed communication system. Roberto and Giuseppe's men are fighting each other 3 blocks away, while Angelo's forces are trying to reach us through the eastern approach. The plan was working perfectly. By providing Roberto with evidence of Giuseppe's theft at precisely the right moment, they had triggered the civil war within the false Castellano leadership that would tear their organization apart from within. Angelo was caught between supporting one cousin against the other or trying to maintain unity while under attack from the Sant'Angelos. Lila appeared at Marco's side, her white dress now splattered with blood that wasn't her own. "The Moretti assault team is in the wine cellar," she reported, reloading her weapon with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. "Vincent has them pinned down, but they're trying to reach the house through the service tunnels. Take half of Maria's team and cut them off," Marco replied, parrying a knife thrust before driving his sword through his attacker's chest. "I'll handle the main assault." As Lila moved toward the house, Marco felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with her combat skills. She was thinking tactically, seeing the larger pattern of the battle while engaging specific threats. The woman he had chosen to bear his heirs had become his true partner in every sense of the word. The fight raged through the gardens that had been carefully landscaped over generations, ancient rose bushes providing cover for modern warfare, while marble statues bore witness to violence that would have been familiar to their Renaissance creators. The Sant'Angelo estate had been built to withstand sieges, and its defenders knew every advantage the terrain provided. Don Marco, one of his soldiers, called out, "The village delegation is requesting permission to join the fight." Through the smoke and chaos, Marco could see a group of men from Ravenshollow approaching with hunting rifles and grim determination. The villagers who had sold Lila as a joke now understood exactly what they had unleashed, and they were seeking redemption through blood. "Grant them the honor," Marco replied, his sword finding another target. "Let them earn their forgiveness." As the battle reached its crescendo, Marco realized that this wasn't just about defending his wedding or even protecting his empire. This was about something larger, the moment when old powers fell and new ones rose to take their place. The girl who had been sold as worthless was claiming her birthright as the rightful heir to the Castellano dynasty, and anyone who stood in her way would be swept aside by the tide of change she represented. The sword in his hands had tasted blood in defense of Sant'Angelo honor for 5 centuries. Today, it would help crown a new queen of the criminal underworld. Angelo Castellano wore the crown of thorns he had commissioned for this moment, a twisted circlet of blackened metal, designed to symbolize the price of absolute power and the sacrifices required to seize it from those too weak to hold it. He had planned to place it on his own head after killing the pretender who dared claim his family's empire. But now he faced her in the mansion's grand hall with growing understanding that he had vastly underestimated his opponent. "You should have stayed hidden in your mountain hovel," Angelo snarled, his gun trained on Lila as she stood between overturned furniture and shattered crystal. The crown of thorns gleamed dully in the light from the chandelier that had somehow survived the battle raging throughout the house. "Elena's bastard has no place among the powerful." Lila's wedding dress was torn and blood-stained, but her posture remained regal as she faced the man who had murdered her grandfather and stolen her inheritance. "I am Elena Rosewood's daughter," she said with quiet dignity that cut through the chaos around them. "And I am Alessandro Castellano's rightful heir. You are nothing but a thief wearing my family's name." The crown of thorns represented everything Angelo believed about power, that it belonged to those ruthless enough to take it and hold it, regardless of blood or law. He had built his authority on violence and fear, crushing anyone who challenged his right to rule through sheer brutality. But facing Lila now, he could see something in her eyes that chilled him more than any threat. She wasn't afraid. "Your grandfather disowned your mother," Angelo spat, trying to maintain his psychological advantage. He declared her dead rather than acknowledge her shameful choices. "What makes you think you deserve what he denied her?" "He never changed his will," Lila replied simply. "Despite his public pronouncements, he never removed my mother as his heir. That tells me everything I need to know about his true feelings and about the legitimacy of your claim." Marco appeared in the doorway behind Angelo, his sword still dripping blood from the battles fought throughout the estate. But he made no move to interfere. This confrontation belonged to Lila alone. It was her birthright to reclaim, her justice to dispense. "The other families will never accept you," Angelo said desperately. "You're a woman, a nobody from nowhere. They'll tear you apart the moment you try to claim power." "They already tried," Lila said, gesturing toward the destruction around them. "Your allies are dead or dying. The Morettis are scattered. The false Castellano leadership is destroying itself through civil war." "I'm not trying to claim power, Angelo. I've already taken it." Angelo's hand trembled as he raised his gun, but Lila moved with the deadly grace she had perfected over months of training. The blade that had been concealed in her wedding bouquet found its mark before he could pull the trigger. And Angelo Castellano died, wearing the crown of thorns he had hoped to place on his own head. Lila reached down and lifted the twisted circlet from his lifeless fingers, studying its brutal design. The crown was meant to symbolize the price of power, but Angelo had misunderstood what that price truly was. He thought it meant being willing to inflict suffering on others. In reality, it meant being willing to bear the weight of responsibility for something larger than yourself. "Will you wear it?" Marco asked quietly, approaching through the wreckage of what had been their wedding reception. Lila looked at the crown of thorns, then set it aside. "Power doesn't require symbols," she said. "It requires results." Through the mansion's broken windows, she could see the estate's grounds, where the bodies of their enemies lay scattered among the roses. The villagers from Raven's Hollow stood guard over prisoners, their faces showing the grim satisfaction of men who had finally chosen the right side of history. Vincent was coordinating the cleanup with his usual efficiency, while Maria's security teams secured the perimeter against any remaining threats. The war was over. The girl sold as a joke had become the woman who ruled the criminal underworld through intelligence, strength, and the kind of justice that transcended law. But more than that, she had found something she had never expected when Marco claimed her at that auction. She had found her true self, and discovered that strength really could be found in the most unexpected places. The crown of thorns lay forgotten as Lila walked toward her future. No longer needing symbols to prove her worth to anyone, the new family portrait was commissioned 3 months after the wedding battle, painted by an artist who specialized in capturing the subtle dynamics of power relationships. Unlike the formal individual portraits that lined the Sant'Angelo gallery, this painting showed Marco and Lila together, equal partners seated side by side, their hands intertwined, their expressions reflecting the hard-won wisdom of those who had fought for their position and emerged victorious. The artist had captured something remarkable in their faces. Marco's familiar strength was still evident, but now tempered with the contentment of a man who had found his true match. Lila's transformation was even more dramatic. Gone was any trace of the frightened girl from Raven's Hollow, replaced by a woman whose intelligence and determination were evident in every line of her posture. "The territorial redistributions are complete," Vincent reported as he joined them in the mansion's restored Great Hall. The room bore few signs of the violence that had erupted during their wedding, though Lila had insisted on keeping one bullet hole in the marble wall as a reminder of how quickly peace could transform into war. The past months had seen the most dramatic reshuffling of criminal power in decades. With the false Castellano leadership eliminated and their allies scattered or dead, vast territories and enterprises had fallen under Sant'Angelo control. But rather than simply absorbing everything, Lila had chosen a different approach, one that demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made her such a valuable partner. The legitimate businesses will continue operating under professional management, she explained to the assembled captains who now served both families. The Castellano restaurants, construction companies, and import operations generate significant legal income and provide excellent cover for our other activities. Marco watched with pride as his wife, for they had completed their interrupted wedding ceremony in private, with only Vincent and Maria as witnesses, outlined the new structure of their combined empire. She had proven herself in battle, but it was her skill at organization and long-term planning that truly impressed the veteran criminals who had initially doubted her worthiness. The illegal enterprises require more careful integration, she continued, moving pieces on a map that showed their expanded territory. Giuseppe's gambling operations were profitable, but poorly managed. Roberto's smuggling network had good routes, but inadequate security. By combining Sant'Angelo resources with Castellano infrastructure, we can improve both efficiency and safety. The village of Ravenshollow had undergone its own transformation. The mountain community that had sold Lila as a joke now found itself under the protection of the most powerful crime family in the region. Rather than seeking revenge, Lila had chosen a path that demonstrated both her strength and her wisdom. The old village council has been replaced, Maria reported. New leadership, new priorities. The baker's wife, Rosa, has been appointed as the village administrator. She understands both local needs and our expectations. Matthias Blackwood, the elder who had orchestrated Lila's auction, had simply disappeared one night, leaving behind only a note expressing his deep regret for past actions and his intention to seek redemption through exile. Whether his disappearance was voluntary or assisted remained a topic of speculation, though no one was particularly motivated to investigate. The mountain roads are being improved, Vincent added. Better access will allow for increased commerce, both legal and otherwise. The villagers who once saw Lila as a burden now understand that she represents their path to prosperity. But it was the smaller details that revealed the true scope of Lila's transformation. Where the old Castellano leadership had ruled through fear alone, she had introduced concepts of loyalty earned rather than demanded, of protection that extended beyond mere business relationships. The families who remain neutral during the conflict have requested meetings, Marco reported. They want to understand the new order, to determine how they fit into a world where traditional power structures have been fundamentally altered. Lila studied the portrait that would eventually join the gallery, alongside generations of Sant'Angelo patriarchs. But unlike those solo displays of individual authority, this painting told a different story, one of partnership, shared power, and the strength that came from unity rather than isolation. Schedule the meetings, she decided, but make it clear that we're not seeking their approval or requesting their cooperation. We're informing them of the new reality and offering them the opportunity to adapt to it. The girl who had been sold as worthless had become the woman who redefined what power looked like, not a crown worn by a single ruler, but a shared authority that was stronger because it was built on genuine partnership and mutual respect. The Heirs' cradle arrived on a crisp morning in early spring, 6 months after Lila had discovered she was carrying the next generation of the Sant'Angelo Castellano dynasty. Crafted by master artisans from wood taken from trees that had grown on both family estates, the cradle represented more than furniture. It was a promise of continuity, a symbol of hope that the future would be built on stronger foundations than the violent past. The cradle's design told the story of two bloodlines joining into something greater than either had been alone. Carved roses intertwined with thorns along the sides, representing beauty that had survived hardship. The headboard bore both family crests, the Sant'Angelo eagle and the Castellano lion. But rather than competing for dominance, they were positioned as guardians, watching over the space where their heir would rest. The doctor confirms everything is progressing normally, Marco said, his hand resting gently on Lila's growing belly as they stood together in the nursery that had been prepared with military precision. 6 weeks remaining, according to his calculations. Lila smiled, feeling the child stir within her as if responding to his father's voice. The pregnancy had been easier than she had dared hope, perhaps because she was no longer fighting for survival on a daily basis, or perhaps because her body finally had the nutrition and care it needed to support new life. Vincent has increased security protocols, she said, running her fingers along the cradle's smooth surface. No one approaches the estate without multiple layers of clearance. The nursery has been swept for surveillance devices daily. Every member of the household staff has been re-vetted. The precautions weren't paranoia, but practical necessity. The child Lila carried would inherit not just wealth and power, but also the enemies that came with both. From the moment of birth, he or she would be a target for anyone who opposed the new order they had established. The other families have sent gifts, Marco reported, gesturing toward a collection of expensive items that had been thoroughly examined by security experts before being allowed into the house. Gold rattles from the DeMarcos, silk blankets from the Morettis, a set of silver cups from the Torinos. Each gift represented a form of submission, acknowledgement that the child would be born into a position of unquestioned authority. Even former enemies now sought to curry favor with the family that had demonstrated their ability to destroy anyone who opposed them. Rosa sent something as well, Lila said, pointing to a simple wooden toy that sat beside the ornate presents from crime families. The baker's wife from Ravenshollow had carved it herself, a small horse that rocked gently when touched. It was worth nothing compared to the gold and jewels surrounding it. But Lila treasured it more than all the expensive offerings combined. The transformation of their relationship with the village had been one of the most satisfying aspects of their victory. Where once the people of Ravenshollow had treated her as a curse to be endured, they now spoke of her with pride. Their local girl who had risen to command an empire, who had brought prosperity to their struggling mountain community. The education plans are complete, Marco continued, producing a thick folder that detailed arrangements for their child's future. Private tutors for languages, mathematics, and classical education. Combat training will begin at age 7. Strategy and business management by age 12. But it was Lila who would provide the most important education. The lessons about seeing strength in unexpected places, about recognizing value where others saw only burden, about building power through intelligence and partnership rather than fear and isolation. What if the child is a daughter? Lila asked, voicing a question that had been in her mind for weeks. Marco's smile was immediate and genuine. Then she'll be raised to rule just as you have, with wisdom, strength, and absolute confidence in her right to command respect. The idea of a daughter inheriting their empire would have been revolutionary in the traditional criminal underworld, but Lila had already proven that women could wield power as effectively as men when given the opportunity. Their child, regardless of gender, would grow up in a world where strength of character mattered more than accident of birth. As evening approached, Lila found herself standing by the nursery window, looking out over the estate grounds, where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. Somewhere in those gardens, she had fought for her life and claimed her destiny. Now she would bring new life into a world she had helped reshape through courage, intelligence, and the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure. The heir's cradle waited patiently, ready to hold the future of two great families, united by the most unlikely love story of all. The Golden Scales arrived as a gift from the International Council of Criminal Families, a recognition that Lila Santangelo Castellano had achieved something unprecedented in the underworld's long history. Crafted from actual gold and perfectly balanced, the scales represented justice tempered with mercy, the kind of measured leadership that transformed criminal organizations from mere gangs into institutions that could survive for generations. 1 year after the birth of their daughter Isabella, named for Marco's great-grandmother, but bearing the fierce independence of her mother, Lila stood in her private office studying reports that detailed the scope of their empire's transformation. The scales sat on her desk as both decoration and reminder that every decision carried weight that extended far beyond immediate consequences. The protection network now covers 17 communities, Vincent reported during their weekly strategy meeting. Crime rates have dropped 40% in areas under our jurisdiction. The villages that once struggled with poverty are reporting steady economic growth. The model they had developed represented a radical departure from traditional criminal governance. Rather than simply extracting wealth from their territories, they had created systems that generated prosperity for everyone under their protection. Businesses thrived because they received real security rather than mere extortion. Citizens felt safe because justice was swift and certain, even if it operated outside conventional legal frameworks. The other families are requesting consultations, Marco added, reviewing correspondence from criminal organizations across 3 countries. They want to understand how we've achieved such stability and profitability simultaneously. Lila smiled as she watched Isabella playing in the corner of the office, her daughter's bright laughter filling a room where life and death decisions were made daily. The child had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, but she was growing up in a world where power came with responsibility rather than just privilege. The legitimate businesses are exceeding projections, Maria reported. The restaurants, construction companies, and import operations generate enough legal income to support our entire organization. The illegal enterprises have become supplementary rather than primary revenue sources. This transformation had been Lila's greatest innovation, proving that criminal organizations could evolve beyond simple lawbreaking into complex entities that provided genuine value to their communities. Protection meant actual safety, not manufactured threats. Business partnerships meant mutual prosperity, not parasitic exploitation. Matthias Blackwood sent another letter, Vincent said quietly, producing an envelope marked with the seal of a monastery in Switzerland. He continues to request permission to return to Ravens Hollow. The former village elder had spent the past year seeking redemption through religious service. His letters filled with genuine remorse for his treatment of Lila and desperate pleas for forgiveness. Some of Marco's advisors had suggested that permanent exile was insufficient punishment for his crimes, but Lila had chosen a different path. He may return, she decided, but under conditions that ensure he understands how thoroughly the world has changed. Rosa will determine his role in the new village. Structure. The decision reflected the philosophy that had guided all of Lila's leadership choices. Justice, that aimed for rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. Strength that lifted others rather than crushing them. Power that served larger purposes rather than personal ego. The birthday celebration preparations are complete, Marco said, his tone shifting to something more personal. Isabella's first birthday deserves proper recognition. The party would be attended by representatives from criminal families across the globe, each seeking to establish relationships with the child who would someday inherit the most powerful and innovative criminal empire in the world. But it would also include Rosa from Ravenshollow, Dr. Santos from the university, and dozens of others whose lives had been improved by the new order Lila had established. As the meeting concluded and their advisors departed, Lila found herself alone with Marco and Isabella in the office, where she had learned to wield power with wisdom. The golden scales caught the afternoon light, their perfect balance reflecting the delicate equilibrium she had achieved between justice and mercy, strength and compassion. "Do you ever miss it?" Marco asked quietly, gathering Isabella into his arms as she reached for him with tiny hands. "The simplicity of your old life?" Lila considered the question seriously, thinking of the frightened girl who had once scrounged for vegetables behind the baker's shop. "I miss not knowing how much evil existed in the world," she said finally, "but I don't miss being powerless to change it." Through her office window, she could see the estate grounds where spring flowers bloomed in gardens that had witnessed both violence and victory. Beyond those grounds lay an empire built on principles that proved strength could indeed be found in the most unexpected places, and that true power came not from inspiring fear, but from earning the kind of loyalty that would last for generations. 5 years after the village auction that changed everything, the legacy stone stood in the center of Ravenshollow's transformed square, a monument of polished granite bearing an inscription that had become legend throughout the region. Strength can be found in the most unexpected places. Children, who had never known hunger or fear, played around its base while their parents conducted business in a thriving market that attracted visitors. From across the mountains, Lila Santangelo Castellano stood before the monument with her 3 children. Isabella, now 4 and already showing signs of her mother's sharp intelligence. Marco Jr., 2 years old and bearing his father's determined expression. And infant Elena, named for the grandmother she would never meet, but whose courage flowed in her veins. The family had come to Ravenshollow for the annual celebration that marked not just Lila's rescue from poverty, but the community's transformation from a place of cruelty into something approaching paradise. "Tell us the story again, Mama," Isabella requested, settling on the stone steps with the confidence of a child who had never doubted her place in the world. "Once upon a time," Lila began, using the traditional opening, though everyone present knew this was no fairy tale but living history. "There was a village where people forgot that every person has worth, even when that worth isn't immediately visible." Rosa approached from the bakery that had expanded into the finest restaurant in the mountain region, her prosperity evident in her elegant clothing and the respectful nods she received from everyone she passed. She had become Ravenshollow's mayor through popular election, proving that kindness could indeed be rewarded when the powerful chose to support rather than exploit it. "The celebrations are ready to begin," Rosa announced, though her formal words couldn't hide the warmth in her voice as she looked at the children who called her grandmother Rosa despite no blood relationship. "The entire valley has come to honor the anniversary." Through the square, Lila could see delegations from dozens of communities that had requested inclusion in the Santangelo Castellano Protection Network. Representatives from legitimate businesses, educational institutions, and even government officials who had learned that cooperation with their organization brought stability and prosperity that traditional law enforcement couldn't match. "The university partnership has exceeded all projections," Dr. Santos reported. Joining them beside the monument, graduate students from 12 countries are studying our model of community-integrated criminal justice. Several governments have quietly requested consultations about implementing similar systems. The academic recognition had been unexpected but deeply satisfying. What they had built through necessity and intuition was being studied as a revolutionary approach to governance that transcended traditional distinctions between legal and illegal. Authority. Marco appeared with Vincent and Maria, their faces showing the satisfied exhaustion of people who had spent the morning reviewing security for an event that attracted international attention. The gathering was both celebration and demonstration, proof that criminal organizations could evolve beyond simple exploitation into institutions that genuinely served their communities. "The other families' representatives have all arrived," Marco reported. "They're here not just to pay respects, but to learn. What we've accomplished is being replicated across 3 continents." Lila looked around the square, where she had once been sold like livestock, now transformed into a place where her children played safely while building relationships that would serve them throughout their lives. The legacy stone bore witness to a transformation, so complete that visitors often refused to believe the old stories about Ravenshollow's cruel past. "What's most important," she told her children as the celebration began around them, "isn't that Mama became powerful enough to change things. It's that we learned to see strength where others saw only weakness, to find value where others saw only burden." Isabella nodded seriously, already understanding that her inheritance included not just wealth and influence, but responsibility for using both wisely. Marco Jr. was too young for such lessons, but he would grow up in a world where such wisdom was simply part of daily life. As evening approached and the celebrations reached their peak, Lila found herself thinking about the girl who had once crouched behind the baker's shop. sorting through discarded vegetables and dreaming of simply having enough to eat. That girl couldn't have imagined the life that awaited her. But she had possessed the inner strength necessary to seize opportunity when it finally arrived. The legacy stone would stand for generations, reminding future visitors that the most powerful transformations often begin with someone everyone else has dismissed as worthless. In a world that too often measured value by immediate appearances, it served as permanent proof that true worth sometimes required patience, wisdom, and the courage to look beyond surface judgments to discover the hidden treasures that existed in the most unexpected places.